Today at the National Press Club, Lyle Shelton and Karina Ocatel present the No case ahead of the same-sex marriage postal survey. Mr Shelton's the Managing Director of the Australian Christian Lobby, while Ms Ocatel is a Liberal Party Vice President. Here's today's National Press Club address.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, welcome to the National Press Club here in Canberra. My name is Mark Kenny. You may know me from such publications as the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, but I'm also a director of the National Press Club. Last week we heard from the proponents of marriage equality. Shortly after that, the High Court approved the government's somewhat novel postal survey, and from yesterday the Australian Bureau of Statistics began sending its forms out to voting-age Australians. This week it's the turn of the No case. To present their argument against broadening the definition of marriage to incorporate same-sex couples, we have Lyle Shelton, who is Managing Director of the Australian Christian Lobby, and Karina Ocatel, a Vice President of the Liberal Party of Australia. Would you please join me in welcoming them to the National Press Club? Now, by agreement, I think Karina Ocatel is to kick off proceedings, so I'll invite her to move to the lectern. Thank you very much.
Effing hell, man. What are you doing letting your wife run around like a brain-dead Sarah Palin, spewing homophobic rubbish in public? I know a good way to help cure her of her dread of sodomy. If not, at least give her a talking to. Your wife comes across as a hysterical, sanctimonious and arrogant person. This is a letter an anonymous person sent my friend Mareka, who's here today. She received it, which her husband had found, left at his office, after she'd posted a video online expressing her concerns about legalising same-sex marriage. The vitriolic abuse people experience for holding views in opposition to the legalisation of same-sex marriage is phenomenal. A culture has developed whereby it's acceptable to vilify, mock, abuse and shame anyone who stands in the way or even raises questions about whether we should legalise same-sex marriage. I've been called a homophobe, a bigot, and been told that my views are disgusting. I count anyone brave who's added a Facebook banner to their profile saying that they're voting no, as almost inevitably they've copped a torrent of hate. And why is this? The Yes campaign have framed their debate about being one for equality and for justice. And who could stand against this? When I first considered the legalisation of same-sex marriage several years ago, I was all for it. I thought that if two consenting adults want to marry, what does it hurt anyone else? And at that point in time, I would have voted yes. But the more I looked into the issue, and the more I've observed the experience of other countries that have legalised same-sex marriage, my concerns grew. You cannot, after all, fundamentally shift an institution we've always had that is practiced the world over without there being consequences. The first country to legalise same-sex marriage did so in 2001, and we only have recent history from which we can observe the consequences. But the consequences that flow from legalising same-sex marriage should not be ignored. In all of the arguments of the Yes campaign, they never do talk about what impact same-sex marriage has had on basic freedoms. They simply say the sky won't fall in. Sure, but we can talk about what has actually occurred. When same-sex marriage was legalised in Massachusetts, children were given literature, including that it's a myth that marriage is about children, and a myth that children are best served when raised by a mother and father. When parents complained about a picture book shown to children with a same-sex couple kissing, Their school said that they'd continue to read these books. The parents took the matter to court, but the court found that schools now have an obligation to normalise same-sex marriage. Last year in Ireland, a baker was found guilty of unlawful discrimination for refusing to bake a cake with the words "support gay marriage." This year, the same baker was targeted again by activists who believed that he should be punished once more for his stance. In Canada, law graduates from a Christian university are refused admission to practice in certain parts of the country because the university holds the view that marriage is between a man and a woman. 3 months ago in England, a Jewish school failed 3 inspections as they didn't teach about homosexuality and gender diversity, and therefore, as same-sex marriage is legal, the students were not being provided a full understanding of fundamental British values, and that school now faces closure. Currently in England, where same-sex marriage was only legalised 3 years ago, a same-sex couple are taking the Church of England to court to require them to officiate their wedding, challenging the religious exemptions that were enshrined in British law. Later this year, a student will go to the UK High Court to ask to be readmitted to university after being thrown out of his social work degree for expressing his view about marriage on his personal Facebook page. 3 weeks ago, in our own country, the Shadow Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, said that if Labor are in office, and we hope that doesn't happen, don't we? They will examine any potential exemptions that would go some way to providing protections for churches, mosques and temples. Bill Shorten has previously committed a future Labor government to winding back religious freedom protections offered in any same-sex marriage legislation. Labor would also establish an LGBTIQ watchdog, funded by taxpayers, to monitor and take action against Australians. And last week, GetUp started a petition to deregister Dr. Pansy Lai, who challenged the legalisation of same-sex marriage in the Coalition for Marriage's television advertisement. And this is while same-sex marriage still remains unlawful. In all the arguments of the Yes campaign, they never do talk about what impact same-sex marriage has had on basic freedoms. Clearly, there are significant consequences in terms of the impact on free speech, religious freedom and the rights of parents. And this is just at the beginning, when same-sex marriage has only been legal for a short period of time in a minority of countries. What happens when a whole generation who've grown up with same-sex marriage and gender theory as the norm become the legislators? The easy path for me would be to ignore these questions and support same-sex marriage. I don't like being thought of as homophobic. I am not, and I refuse to accept that label. I have dedicated my professional life and everything I do to fighting for justice and equality. But if the debate is just about love, then why have any legislation at all? Presently, same-sex couples have the same rights as de facto couples in law. Even if you don't want to be considered a committed couple, after 2 years of living together, that is what the law says you are. You can also register relationships at any time. Marriage, on the other hand, always has been about the law assisting the stability of the family unit. Of course, there are exceptions and unforeseen circumstances, but fundamentally, this is what marriage is all about. When Yes campaigners talk about equality, they're talking about equality for adults and their wishes. What is left out of the conversation is the rights of children. What the Yes campaign is really about is asking the state to sanction the creation of an institution that, by design, will contain children who may never know or have relationships with their biological parents as their family. 8 weeks ago, I had my 3rd child, and I stand here today extremely sleep-deprived and with a pretty serious case of baby brain, so apologies. But I stand here because I do fight for justice and equality, and I do so for those whose voices have been left out of this debate, the most vulnerable, children. In legalising same-sex marriage, we are telling children that they must not feel any yearning or incompleteness in not knowing, having a relationship with, or being parented by the person from whom they received half of their genes. This is what happened to Millie Fontana, an adult child of a lesbian couple. Millie describes the gay community as promoting this ideology that love is love and that we don't actually need any biological roots at all to be parented well and to be well-adjusted and happy. She says that this has been incorrect for me and for many others, and the promotion of this ideology has made it difficult for me and people in my position to come forward and say what is actually going on. But even the voices of those like Millie are being shouted down by a campaign that doesn't tolerate any opposition. I'm often asked how I would feel if my child were same-sex attracted, and my answer is I do now and always will love them unconditionally, regardless of their sexual orientation. The questions, though, that I do not hear being asked are, would you be happy for your grandchild to deliberately never know their biological parent? What type of society do we want them to grow up in? What do you want them to learn in school? If same-sex marriage becomes lawful, then children will be taught about this in schools. They will be taught about gender fluidity and sexual subjects. Yet surely children have the right not to be confused by adult agendas. And in legalising same-sex marriage, we would inevitably lose the freedoms to call this out because it would be viewed as discriminatory to do so. It is an entirely Western-centric view to say that legalising same-sex marriage equates to progress. In claiming that other Western countries have legalised same-sex marriage and therefore Australia should too, is to suggest that the majority of other countries that have not are somehow backwards. In a multi-ethnic society like Australia, this suggestion is even more hard to take. I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you and for you to have listened to me so respectfully today without being shouted down yet or ridiculed. But this is not the experience of those who speak outside the confines of this room against the legalisation of same-sex marriage. I honour my friend, Chella White, who's here with us today. She's a courageous woman who spoke out about her son being told he could wear a dress in school as part of the Safe Schools program on the Coalition for Marriage's television advertisement. I first met Chella when she spoke at a forum about the program over a year ago. Her story has always been consistent about what their school taught her son. Her mother attended the meeting at school with Chella about her concerns. If anyone looks at the content and promotional material for the Safe Schools program, it's clear that children are encouraged to wear the uniform of their choice. Yet, for speaking out in opposition to the legalisation of same-sex marriage, she was publicly called a liar. She received abusive messages on Facebook every 2 minutes to the point that she shut down her Facebook account. These messages were from people from all walks of life, including someone who worked at a suicide prevention hotline. She would be standing here speaking to you today, but for the abuse she's already received as a result of telling her story. If we cannot speak freely now without attack, when same-sex marriage has not been legalised, what consequences yet lie ahead if it is? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Karina. It seems you've won them over. I might invite Lyle Shelton to take the stand, or should that be take the lectern?
Well, it's nice to know that the crowd is a little different to the audience at Q&A. So, I want to start my address today by offering an apology. This is a very emotion-charged debate for many people in Australia. And Karina has talked about some of the vitriol. We've experienced that at ACL. And yes, it does exist on both sides of the debate. But going back to the early 1980s, at the height of the AIDS crisis in San Francisco, when gay men were dying like flies, people who represented Christian organisations said some very hateful and hurtful things. And I just want to say here today that for those who might think that people like myself and Karina represent that viewpoint, I want to say we're sorry for what happened back in those days. It was a generation ago, it was before my time, but nonetheless wounds were there and I think still exist to this day, and probably with some justification by our friends in the LGBTIQ community. So I just want to start by offering that as an apology from myself. I'm not here representing the church or anyone else, but I just think that needs to be said. I don't have a black armband view of Christian history. We have a mixed record as Christians, and I'm really proud to say that here in Australia, that at St Vincent's Hospital, they were taking the first AIDS victims of this mysterious disease that was starting to afflict men in Sydney. And the nuns at St Vincent's treated those men when the disease was largely a mystery. They lifted cups of water to their lips. And that was, I think, a moment of great compassion, and they pioneered the treatment of AIDS in this country. So we have a mixed record as people of faith in our dealings with our friends in the same-sex community. This debate is not about love or hate or who loves or who hates the most. This is a debate about public policy that has real consequences, as Karina has so eloquently said today. Paul Kelly, who wrote a very interesting piece in today's Australian, in fact stole my press club speech, he said that the real art of political leadership is to change the established order in necessary and enduring ways. I want to say today that there is a political move to change the established order, but I would argue that it's not in necessary ways, but it will be in enduring ways if it goes ahead. There's three reasons why I think we should, as Australians, vote no in this postal plebiscite. The first is the issue of freedoms, and Karina has touched on this. But I think we all need to realise that it was one of the most prominent leaders of the same-sex marriage movement, Rodney Croome, who I know, and we've met many times in the corridors of Parliament, but he is the one who said, when Archbishop Julian Porteous in Tasmania issued a very gentle pastoral letter outlining Christian teaching on marriage, in fact teaching that many Australians, probably millions of Australians, would agree with. He said that this was hateful and it was prejudice, and he urged people to report Archbishop Julian Porteous to the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Commission, and he was reported. This sent shockwaves through the Christian community in Australia, because no one ever thought that expressing and propagating a biblical Christian view of marriage could find someone involved in a legal and a court process. But Archbishop Porteous was for 6 months. And the case was only dropped because it started to hurt the same-sex marriage cause. Over in the United States right now, there's a 71-year-old grandmother by the name of Baronelle Stutzman. For years, in her florist business in Washington State, she served a gay couple. Rob Ingersoll and his boyfriend would come to her often for flowers. And she had no trouble and no issue with selling flowers to a gay couple. When Washington State changed the definition of marriage in law, they came to her and asked if she would do their same-sex wedding. She politely declined and said that her religious views and her conscience meant that she didn't want to apply her business skills to celebrating a definition of marriage that she didn't agree with. The Attorney General of Washington State filed a lawsuit against her, It was quickly joined by the gay couple, and today, right now, she is before the US Supreme Court on bigotry charges, having lost her cases in lower courts. This is extraordinary. There's a cake maker from Oregon, Jack Phillips, who's also right here, right now, in front of the US Supreme Court because he didn't want to use his cake decoration skills in this way, in the same way that he wouldn't make a cake for a Bucks party or a Halloween party because of his conscious views. But these aren't just for the Only in America file. In Australia, we've seen an executive at IBM and PricewaterhouseCoopers tapped on the shoulder by the diversity officer and basically said that if you don't resign from the board of a Christian charity that supports marriage between a man and a woman, there could be issues for you at work. We've seen Cooper's beer, their bottles smashed in the streets. And all the while we're told by Dean Smith, the Liberal senator from Western Australia, and Tim Wilson, another Liberal proponent of same-sex marriage, that trust us, we can put freedoms in that will protect people's freedom, that nothing will change, that there are no consequences to changing the definition of marriage. We're told this over and over again. And yet if you have a look at what's on the table from the Smith bill, there's a very narrow set of protections for religious clergy only. What about Julian Porteous? What about the Jack Phillipses and the Baronel Stutzman? These are not red herrings. These are real people whose real freedoms are affected and will be affected if the law changes in Australia. And even if the parliament is successful in passing a bill that protects professional religious clergy, what is to become of that as time passes? In Sweden, the Swedish Prime Minister Stefan Löfven has said priests and pastors must celebrate gay weddings or get another job. Now, that's not law yet, but that's what the Prime Minister of Sweden is saying. And just recently, as Paul Kelly wrote this morning, the Speaker of the House of Commons in the UK, just 4 years after same-sex marriage, John Bercow, said that we'll never have complete marriage equality until the Church is compelled to perform same-sex marriages. So the freedoms that are proposed are not worth the paper that they are written on. The second reason after freedoms is because of what will happen in schools and is starting to happen in schools, and that is the propagation of radical LGBTIQ sex education. And we've seen the precursor to this with the so-called Safe Schools program here in Australia, which we have been successful in pushing back. But if the law changes, if gender is taken out of marriage, I don't think we'll have any opportunity to stop these programs. Safe Schools produced a resource, or promoted a resource, called the Gender Ferry for 4-year-olds. It said only you can know if you are a boy or a girl. No one can tell you. Not mummy and daddy, not the doctor who assigned your gender at birth. This is the sort of propaganda that's being put forward under the name of Safe Schools and radical LGBTIQ sex education. And that's the stuff that I can mention at the National Press Club in daytime television. Just recently, Benjamin Law wrote the quarterly essay. This was released, Moral Panic 101. Benjamin Law is a Fairfax columnist and a prominent supporter on the Yes campaign. He makes it very clear in this essay that he thinks Safe Schools should be rolled out nationally. It should be everywhere. He also says that same-sex marriage and safe schools are a top priority of the LGBTIQ political agenda. We're constantly accused of conflating the issues. The mums that Karina referred to, they have copped a torrent of abuse for speaking the truth. They are right to be concerned that these sort of programs will become widespread and compulsory if the marriage law is changed. You've only got to look at what their own activists are saying in the platforms they are given in the quarterly essay and the Fairfax Press. Benjamin Law also says that same-sex marriage is far from the last frontier in the battle against homophobia, whatever that is. I think the same-sex marriage activists need to tell all Australians, as we vote, where this frontier stops. The third reason why I think we need to vote no in this upcoming postal plebiscite is because of the rights of children, and Karina has touched on this. Our former Prime Minister, John Howard, said at the weekend that children, wherever possible, should have the right to their mother and father. I think that's the basis of a civil society. Now, I know that children miss out on their mum and dad because of tragedy or desertion, and no one in their right mind thinks that's a good thing. But to have government policy that requires a child to miss out, I think we need to have a good hard look at ourselves as a society. I think every child should have the right to know the love of their mother and father. That's what marriage equality is really about. It's equality for children. And if we change the definition of marriage, let me just say, people say to me, and journalists put this to me all the time, well, same-sex couples are already having kids. Yes, that's true. Many have children through previous heterosexual relationships, some through sperm donation, a small number through adoption, because it's very hard even for heterosexual couples to adopt in Australia because of the very low numbers. But there's massive limitations on people of the same gender from being able to raise children. We've had 3 parliamentary inquiries that have expressed deep concern about anonymous sperm donation, and that's been forced on the parliaments by people who have been conceived in that way. We have a prohibition in this country on commercial surrogacy, and the global feminist movement is leading a campaign to try and stop all forms of surrogacy. I agree with the global feminists on this. But I was surprised 2 years ago to read in an Australian Human Rights Commission report that was looking at supposed discrimination against same-sex couples that it canvassed the idea for 2 men to be able to access commercial surrogacy in order to benefit from so-called marriage equality. Now, for those who are not up with all the intricacies of bioethics and that which is related to this issue, commercial surrogacy involves the hiring of a woman's womb, it involves buying and selling of eggs, and it involves a commercial trade in human babies. The Australian Human Rights Commission canvassed this. They didn't recommend it, but they canvassed this in their report, Resilient Individuals. I can't believe that this is where the same-sex marriage debate is taking our country and the way it is trashing the human rights of children. In conclusion, I just want to say that, as Karina has said, same-sex couples already have legal rights, equality under the law in this country. Our organisation was instrumental in supporting the then Rudd Labor government under the Attorney-General at the time to remove that discrimination, and we supported that. But changing the definition of marriage then impacts on the freedoms of millions of other Australians, who don't want to fall foul of our anti-discrimination laws, which will be weaponised as a result of a change in the definition of marriage. Millions of parents who don't want their children to be taught radical LGBTIQ sex education will lose their freedoms, just like Steve Takoulis in Canada has. I just want to say, if you are concerned about freedom, if you're concerned about what your children are taught at school, you're not a bigot, you're not homophobic, you don't have irrational fear. These are valid and reasonable concerns which you should be allowed to express, even express them on social media with your friends. If you're concerned about these things, I would encourage you to vote no. If you don't know where the final frontier in the LGBTIQ sex agenda is, same-sex marriage agenda is, if you don't know where that final frontier is, vote no. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lyle. We'll move to a period of questions from journalists here. I might just start by asking a question of both of you that we asked in fairness of the Yes case last week. Would you be prepared to appear in a debate on this stage with the Yes case at some stage before this period of survey is over?
I'd need to check with my campaign, Mark. But look, yes, I'd be very open. I'm not afraid to debate anyone, anywhere, and we'll look forward to any invitation that may or may not come.
Any comment on that?
If you'd like me back.
Well, I think we can start about booking that date. Our first question.
Campaign team.
First question from the West Australian.
Phoebe Wern from the West. Thanks for your speeches. This probably isn't the logical way of going about things, but I'm going to use the first question from the floor to ask about the survey's conclusion. You lose the vote at 11:30 a.m. on November 15. What will be your next move?
That's a good question. Obviously, this is a democratic process. It's a fair process. Yes, it's not the way that we're normally accustomed to voting in this country in terms of a compulsory attendance ballot, but most of the world conducts their elections, referenda, plebiscites in a voluntary manner. So I respect the democratic principles that lie behind this. If we lose, then we'll have to accept the result. Obviously there'll be a discussion about what sort of bill goes forward, and that'll be a debate for then. But I have to say, in all honesty, from my point of view, and I think the other side would say the same, we live in a democracy and people are free to advocate for their point of view. Now, I think it'd become harder to advocate for our point of view if we've lost, and it would take years and years to probably decades to get it back. So there's a lot at stake, but I'll always believe the truth about marriage, win or lose.
Does it change the character of the result, though, if you compare it to the previous process the government was advocating, a plebiscite, or the Yes case, which wanted just a straight parliamentary vote? Does it change the character of the result if, in fact, it's been endorsed by a majority of the Australian people?
Well, I think what the Australian people say carries a lot of weight, and I think whether you're referring to whether it's a compulsory plebiscite or a voluntary one in terms of the...
Yeah, and I suppose particularly whether it is done by a parliamentary vote, which a subsequent government could say, well, we intend to overturn that by a further parliamentary vote, or if it's done like this, is the result, as a result of going to the people directly, more robust?
Look, I think anything that goes to the people is robust, and I'm concerned that there are those on the no side, such as the Leader of the Opposition, Bill Shorten, who is saying that he won't respect the outcome, and if he is elected Prime Minister, he will legislate within 100 days. I also note that Tim Wilson from the Liberal Party, so I'll be bipartisan in my criticism here, he said on radio last week that he'll respect the result for the term of this parliament, but he'll agitate again in the next. So I think it's pretty clear that the other side are keen to carry this on.
I'm really proud that our government is giving the people a say in terms of whether we do take on such a fundamental shift in our society. In terms of what comes next, if a yes vote is returned, my hope is that the government would look at putting in place as many protections as possible for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and I hope too to address issues around children's rights and parental rights as well. My fear, though, is that it will be difficult to navigate those waters with the crossbench that we have at play, and also in the hopefully not to happen event that a Labor government gains power. Bill Shorten has already said that they will look at the Attorney General, Shadow Attorney General rather, looked at whether we can water down those exceptions by examining them, and Bill Shorten has said that an LGBTIQ watchdog would be introduced as well. So they are significant concerns.
Question from the Herald Sun.
James Campbell from the Herald Sun. Just following on from your point about religious protections, if Parliament were to enact a law which protected your Oregon bakers, I think it was Oregon, Washington State baker, from providing granted them the right, a baker the right to refuse to bake a cake for a gay wedding, what would stop someone, say an Orthodox Jew, refusing to bake a cake for a Jew non-Jew marriage, or someone who had a religious objection to interracial marriage from making use of the law to exercise their prejudices? I mean, would such a law, for example, allow hotels to refuse to rent rooms to gay people or interracial couples or mixed religious couples if that was the religious objection of the owner? And how would you stop someone taking that law and taking it to that extreme?
Well, it's a hypothetical. But it is a fair question. I think we're told that there's no consequences to changing the definition of marriage, that people's freedoms won't be affected. But I think as Karina and I have demonstrated today, you won't be allowed to believe what you believe about marriage now, and for that to be the same if it changes. And particularly if you want to live that out publicly in your business or whatever.
There are no small number of people who actually hold the positions that I just described. What would stop them utilising such a law?
Well, I think you'd be talking about a law that, and again hypothetically, that allowed people to continue to believe the same thing about marriage. It would be specific to that. I don't think anyone's suggesting that there should be racial discrimination. I certainly wouldn't be.
Just want to say it's nice to meet you in person, James. I've read your tweets. The issue, I suppose, is fundamentally about religious freedom and whether that is an important thing to protect or not. My view is that it is exceptionally important. If we lose that freedom, then what does that say about democracy in the country we live in?
Next question from Fairfax Media.
Hi, it's Michael Koziol from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Both sides of this debate have claimed, without evidence, that they'll be outspent by their opponents. Will you be honest and upfront today and tell us what is the combined budget of the Coalition for Marriage for this campaign? And secondly, have you accepted or will you accept any money from evangelical churches in the United States, and if so, how much is that?
Thanks for the question, Michael. In relation to the quantum, no, I'm not going to reveal that. I don't think the other side are about to either.
Can someone explain why that is? I mean, both sides have called for honesty in this debate. Can you explain why we can't have that? Why we can't know that?
Well, if you can ask the question to the other side as well. Yeah, and what did they tell you?
They didn't answer it. They didn't answer it either.
That's my answer too.
Well, at least you agree on something.
We do. We do. We're on a unity ticket.
Do you want to go to the other aspect of the
Yeah, no, we've not taken money from evangelical churches in the US.
And don't intend to, or won't?
Don't intend to. But look, Alan Joyce just gave the other side $1 million, so we are very much behind the 8 ball. This is a David and Goliath battle. So if anyone wants to donate to our campaign, please.
Question from News Corp.
Claire Bickers from News Corp. We heard yesterday about some of the ground rules that will be put in place by the government if they pass today. Those include making it an offence to vilify, intimidate or threaten anyone based on their religious beliefs, gender identity or sexual orientation. To both of you, do you think these are necessary? And do you think they go far enough? For instance, for your friend Chella, that's not a religious view, it doesn't seem like. Will this protect her?
No. It wouldn't protect her. And that's the terrifying thing, is that when you have freedom of speech being under attack like this, that means that if people do speak out, then they will be attacked back. And that is a reality. But when you bring in those types of laws as well, what you're looking at is limiting free speech in a way that prevents a debate. And my hope is, though, that the debate can be reasonable and sensible, and I do hope that from this point on that will happen.
Can I just add to that,
yes.
Mark? This is a really important issue because, as I understand it, the government was looking at some sort of Commonwealth override of state-based anti-discrimination legislation. That is recognition that there are consequences to changing the definition of marriage for freedom of speech, just as we saw Archbishop Porteous. And last year, when it looked like there was going to be a compulsory attendance plebiscite, I think Fairfax asked me about this, and I said, well, for the campaign there should be a Commonwealth override because we don't want to see more Julian Porteous cases for simply expressing the views that Karina and I expressed today. You can be taken off and basically accused of hate speech and taken to a tribunal. Now, I think it's very telling that that couldn't be part of the campaign period as part of the so-called safeguards legislation. I think it does bell the cat on this idea that there are no consequences. I don't normally reveal the conversations I have with ministers, but we had this discussion with the Attorney-General, George Brandis, last year, and we said to him, this will weaponise state-based anti-discrimination legislation. If you think that is changing the definition of marriage will. And I said to him, if you think that 18C creates a problem for free speech, and that's referring to the Federal Racial Discrimination Act, changing the definition of marriage and the consequences, the flow-on effect then to state-based anti-discrimination legislation in particular will make 18C look very mild. He didn't disagree with that proposition, but he said, I'm dealing with federal law, that's a matter for the states. Now, again, what other piece of legislation would the Parliament look at in isolation to its impact on state and territory law? This is a very strange debate.
2CC.
Thank you both very much. Tim Short from Radio 2CC in Canberra. Marriage seems to be very popular here in Australia. More than 120,000 on average from 2013 to 2015 have been married in this country. A lot of Australians don't realise, but New Zealand passed same-sex marriage laws back in 2013. 80,000 New Zealanders have been married during that period, and of those 80,000, 1,600 were same-sex couples. Can I get feedback from both of you? You've cited Europe, you've cited the United States, and your fears and concerns, but have you actually gone across the ditch to find out what they're doing? And secondly, can you, on behalf of the Australians that have been adopted, that are in loving families, who have no idea who their biological father is, say in the case of an adopted child, how do you argue that changes to the Marriage Act are going to be difficult for same-sex couples who can't identify or choose not to identify to their children? How do you draw that parallel? So on New Zealand experience and on adoption. Thank you.
Who would like to go first?
I can comment on the New Zealand. Well, I don't want to take away from Karina, but my very good friend in Auckland, Bob McCroskey, who runs the Family First organisation. It's not a political party, it's an advocacy group for family values there. He was involved in this campaign, and just in the last month or so, his charitable status is now under attack, and he's been threatened with deregistration by the Charities Authority. I don't know the specific name of their regulator there, but specifically because his views on marriage and family don't accord with New Zealand values anymore. Now, I've probably got that terminology a little bit wrong, but that's in essence, and you can go on the Family First website and see that. So that's but one example of how a charity had charitable status before same-sex marriage, and now that the law has changed, there's consequences that are starting to bite for Bob. With regard to adoption, look, this is important, and I perhaps should have had some more caveats in my talk. If a child misses out on their biological mother and father and needs to be placed into adoption, of course that happens. But as a civil society, we do our best to make sure that a mother and a father figure replaces what that child has lost. And we should always seek to do that, because gender is not irrelevant to parenting and to the formation of a child.
Would you like to add to that, Karina?
It's difficult to add to that, but yes, there are always exceptional circumstances where children won't be raised by their biological parents, and take my hat off to people who do stand in the gap and provide that parenting role. Absolutely, absolutely. But to intentionally create, through legislation, through the legalisation of same-sex marriage, a situation where children will be intended to be brought into a family without that opportunity to know one or more of their biological parents, that is where I think we're going wrong.
A question from The Guardian Australia.
Paul Karp from Guardian Australia, a separate one for each of you. Lyle, how concerned are you that the new anti-vilification laws will limit what you can say in the debate, and have you had legal advice about your stolen generation comment? And perhaps, Karina, if we could please start with you. Is it really only same-sex marriage that you are concerned will be normalised, or are you concerned that same-sex marriage will normalise queer attraction and love? Because the example you gave today of a picture book showing two people kissing is not about marriage, it's about love. And I just would like you to explain what you see as not normal about that image.
My issue with images like two people kissing, whether they be of the same sex or opposite sexes, is that I believe it should be up to a parent to decide when their child is exposed to sexualised content, and that, to my mind, is sexualised content. I wouldn't be happy with my children in the early years of primary school being read books with people kissing in it. And I think that's my right as a parent, to be able to choose when my child is exposed to that. So to introduce programs or allow that to happen in schools because of legalisation of same-sex marriage, I find that very troubling if it takes away the rights of mine and other parents' rights.
Can I just tease that out a bit? The Yes campaign says that this is simply a question on whether or not you approve of same-sex couples being allowed to marry. That's where it starts and that's where it ends. You obviously say it doesn't end there, but is it conceivable to have that question? Could we have, with the right legal protections, according to your judgment, same-sex marriage in this country without going down that slippery slope as it's been characterised?
I don't see how, given the experience of other countries. Here we have a Safe Schools program that was introduced, and the New South Wales government, a Liberal government, I'm proud again to say, dismantled that program. If a Liberal government is elected in Victoria, my state, they've also committed to withdrawing from the Safe Schools program. But if same-sex marriage is legalised, what we've seen from other countries, and I brought up the example from Massachusetts where parents took that matter, a similar program of reading or showing kids sexualised content in schools, to court for a determination on whether that was allowable or not. The court returned a decision that said that the school should continue reading such books to kids and showing such material to kids because they now had a duty to normalise same-sex marriage. That's where I do think that slippery slope argument is evidenced, because when we look to the examples of overseas, that's what's occurring.
Can I get you, Lyle, to address the question of vilification laws?
Yeah, sure. Paul, thanks for the question. I have no fear whatsoever with regard to any of the comments that I've made on the public record. I will always stand up and criticise public policy which requires a child to miss out on their mother and a father, not through tragedy or desertion, but because that public policy mandates that. So I'm not worried about these so-called safeguard laws that are being introduced into the parliament today. But we're not the ones who have sent white powder to people's offices and shut down the Canberra Mail Centre. We're not the ones who have sent death threats to and some of my staff are here today who have had to endure death threats on a reasonably regular basis to the telephone. Our office has been bombed. We've had all sorts of vitriol levelled. We've been called homophobes and bigots. The vilification just hasn't stopped. So, look, I don't fear any laws that have been put forward. I'll continue to engage in a constructive and respectful debate without fear of intimidation of people who want to silence what we're trying to say.
Thank you. A question from BuzzFeed.
Hi. Lane Sainty from BuzzFeed. My questions are for you, Lyle. In your speech just now, you referred to homophobia and followed it up by saying whatever that is. I was wondering what you meant by that remark. And a follow-up. Earlier this week, you said on Sky News that you hadn't seen anything derogatory said about LGBTI people during this debate. I was wondering if the call to the ABC from a man who said it was a good move from Hitler to put gays in concentration camps made you change your mind on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Lane. Look, what was the first question?
It was about homophobia.
Homophobia, yeah. Look, I do know what homophobia is, but I don't think it exists much in our country. Maybe there's some people who have that, but I think the vast majority of people that are engaging in this debate from our side who are concerned don't bear any ill will or animus towards their fellow Australians, regardless of their gender or sexual identity. I certainly don't. Homophobia implies an irrational fear. I don't think that's not where the Coalition for Marriage is coming from. It's not where I'm coming from. I've been involved in this debate for a long time. And I just think it's a convenient slur, again, and I'm not saying you do this, Lane, but it's a convenient slur often used to try and intimidate people like us into silence. Well, if you don't support gay marriage, then somehow you're a hater, you're a bigot, you're homophobic. These words have been used against us in the Australian Parliament. We've been called a hate group in the Australian Parliament. So I'm quite frankly tired of that sort of rhetoric. I'm happy to engage a debate, but let's drop the slurs, let's drop the name calling, and let's discuss the issues.
Would you like to add?
Sure. The comment that you mentioned, that's completely inexcusable. That is wrong. That is very wrong. That is homophobic, that is hate-filled, and that shouldn't be occurring.
And can I just add to that too, Chris?
Mark.
Yeah, I knew that. the other Kenny's Chris. Yeah, I learned something. I made that comment on Sky News in the context of the Benjamin Law quarterly essay. No one from our side has suggested, whether in a joking or otherwise manner, that someone should be homosexually raped, from our, as Benjamin Law suggested. I don't think that's funny. No, when I was asked that, I'm thinking in terms of who else is on the sort of moral equivalence on our side of the debate to a Benjamin Law, who's got a platform in the quarterly essay. He's a Fairfax columnist and is allowed to. If I tweeted something like about hate effing people on our side, on the other side of the debate, if I tweeted that, do you think I would be given a platform at the National Press Club, or that I would last very long in my job with the Coalition for Marriage or the Australian Christian Lobby? You haven't seen that sort of vilification and vitriol from any of the leaders on our side of the debate. And I said to people on your side at the start of this campaign, if you see it from our people, let me know and I'll call it out. Well, we're 5 weeks yesterday into this campaign, and yes, there's trolls and there's people like that unfortunate ABC caller on both sides. But I'm referring to the leadership and the leading voices in the yes side who continually do this, and they get a leave pass all the time.
A question from ABC's AM program.
Sabra Lane from AM. Thank you both for addressing the Press Club. Lyle, a question for you. The no vote succeeds, and look into your crystal ball. Labor wins the next election and within 100 days introduces same-sex marriage and says it has a mandate to do that. What will your response be to that? And Karina, just how close do you think this vote will be? Will you be out there door knocking for support? Do you think it's going to come to that?
Would you like to go first, Karina?
Sure. I don't know. That's my answer. I really don't know. And that's why I think it is so important that we are having this postal survey to gauge the public's opinion, because I do think that people haven't had the opportunity to have their say, and we don't know what people are thinking. There may be a case where there is a silent majority one way or the other, and it is important that they're heard from and that our parliamentarians do hear from them in terms of taking the next step in how they legislate.
Is it all about turnout? I mean, this is obviously a voluntary process. We've seen many, many polls over a long period of time suggesting there is broad public support for marriage equality, for a change. Yet you're obviously campaigning quite hard. They've got some pretty big names on their side, including your Prime Minister, Australia's Prime Minister, but your party's Prime Minister. So is it about turnout?
Australia's Prime Minister. He speaks for all of us.
No, I said that. Yes, Australia's Prime Minister.
Yes.
He's from your party. You're the Vice President of the Liberal Party.
Indeed. Look, I think it is important that everyone, when you receive your postal ballot, that you do mark it and have your say, because otherwise, how will the government know where people stand on this issue? I've seen polls swaying on either side, saying that the yes vote is leading, the no vote is leading, and it's very confusing. I think unless people actually put pen to paper and tick whichever box they support, our government won't know what the will of the people is.
And Lyle, you could address the question about what you'll do if the no case prevails, but then the government changes at the next election and Labor proceeds with a parliamentary vote.
Yeah, we're under no illusions in the Coalition for Marriage that if we win and if we are successful come November 15 at 11:30am, that our fight is not over. Bill Shorten and the Labor Party have made their view very clear. They will proceed regardless of the will of the people. Now, if they win an election, I accept that they will have a mandate if the people then vote through a democratic process, knowing that's their policy. So knowing that's the approach that Labor will take at the next election, we're going to be campaigning very heavily against any candidate that doesn't support upholding the definition of marriage and preserving our freedoms and the rights of parents to not have their children exposed to radical LGBTQI sex education. And I note that it's not only Bill Shorten's policy to legislate a redefinition of marriage within 100 days, it's Labor Party policy to fund safe schools from the Commonwealth purse all over Australia. So, this is a package deal. So our battle doesn't end come November 15 if we succeed.
Question from Sky News.
David Spears from Sky News. Thank you both for your address today. The debate really at the moment is a contest of rights. The case you've made is about the rights of the kids, religious leaders, even cake decorators and so on. And on the other side, it's the rights of a gay couple to be treated equally as they see it in the institution of marriage. I just want to draw you to that and tease out what your thinking is on the rights of the gay couple. What do you say to that argument about, they're in a loving, committed relationship, they want to, have the marriage that everyone else can have. What do you say to that issue of those rights? Karina, maybe you first.
Sure. I do think that people who are same-sex attracted should have the same rights as everyone else. And I do believe in terms of relationships that there is equality in terms of the laws. As I mentioned before, whether you're in a same-sex relationship or a heterosexual relationship, the laws around de facto couples applies. Anyone can register a relationship. But what is different when it comes to marriage is that marriage at its core is about raising children. Of course, there are exceptions either way, but fundamentally that's what it's all about. And when we talk about raising kids, if it is through the legalisation of same-sex marriage, what that will lead to is what I've said before, is that you're creating a situation where children, intentionally children, won't necessarily have access to one or more biological parent.
Can I just add to that,
Yes,
Mark?
sure.
David, same-sex couples in Australia are free, they're equal under the law to share their lives. All that discrimination was removed in 2009. I remember that year very well. I spent most of the year working on this. There were numerous Senate inquiries. We engaged with Robert McClelland extensively, and we saw all that discrimination removed. So they are free, they're equal under the law. But it's not the government's role to regulate our love lives. People are free to love whoever they like. But if you change the definition of marriage, that then affects the freedoms of millions of other Australians. So we have freedom and equality for gay people right now, and that's as it should be. But if you change the definition of marriage, that has all the consequences that we've been talking about today. And that's why I think this is where we should draw a line in the sand. I think we've come a long way in terms of our tolerance as a society, but we're now heading to a situation where we're being asked to flip that tolerance sort of equation to a point now where it becomes intolerant to hold any other vision of marriage, and that's not freedom, and I think that's not something that most fair-minded Australians would like to see happen to our country.
Final question today from the Herald Sun.
Tom Anir from the Herald Sun. Thanks for your speeches. My question's for Lyle. Two of the rectors from two of Australia's top Jesuit schools recently, Xavier and Riverview, said that they cautiously expressed support for same-sex marriage to recognise the views of the young people in their care. What did you make of that? And do you agree with their sentiment, essentially saying that the Church hasn't kept pace with the views of young people these days?
Look, I think there's no doubt that many young people have gone with this. It's popular in the culture. In terms of people in church or religious schools that are no longer holding to orthodoxy, I think that's obviously a matter for them. But I also note there's gay people who also don't support redefining marriage, and there was a couple on the 7:30 report the other night. Look, I think we've got a big job to do as a society, as a nation, to rebuild a marriage culture, and it's not the gay people or the same-sex marriage movement that has trashed marriage in this country. We've done a pretty good job as heterosexuals over the last 50 years, and I think we need to start to look at the consequences that's having on our society in terms of family breakdown and the cost on the budget and the cost in terms of the outcomes for young people. And I think we should be really doubling down on how do we actually work better to favour marriage in public policy. That's where I think the real discussion should be, and that is where I think flourishing as a nation really is centred in.
We'll leave it there. Would you join me in thanking Karina Okotel and Lyle Shelton? Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, we don't let people leave the National Press Club. Thank you very much. We don't let people leave the National Press Club empty-handed. I think it says something very good about democracy and the functioning of debate in this country that we're able to have forums like this and both sides get to air their particular arguments. We note your enthusiasm for participating in a debate, so we'll look forward to staging that event at some stage as well. But in the meantime, I've got some reading for you and a membership of the National Press Club. Lyle, that's for you. You're obviously a regular at the club anyway, but there's free car parking there. You'll be happy to know. And Karina, you may be well coming back to Canberra in some other capacity, I suspect, before not too long. So thank you for your address.